A mafia boss disguised himself in his own store and froze when he heard 4 words from the cashier. Just 4 simple words, but they were uttered with such a quiet certainty that Archer Blythe froze, the $5 bill he was holding crinkling in his tight grip. His gaze snapped up, meeting the cashier's clear, observant eyes. She stood behind the counter, a woman with warm brown eyes and an expression that held a subtle, curious energy. Her name tag read Rosalind Glenn, and her calm demeanor, sharp and yet weary, felt utterly misplaced in the nervous tension of the store. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now let's continue. Archer's mind, usually a fortress of cold calculation, momentarily stalled. He was a man accustomed to having his presence felt, not questioned. A lifetime of command had etched an invisible authority onto his face, an authority he had meticulously tried to hide. He was wearing a simple dark hoodie, faded jeans, and large dark sunglasses, a deliberately unremarkable man trying to blend into the city's afternoon crowd. He'd chosen clothing so generic it was practically a disguise itself, designed to render him invisible to anyone who might recognize the true power he held. Yet this young woman, barely out of her teens judging by her demeanor, had seen straight through the superficial layer of fabric and shadow. "Not from here?" Archer repeated, the word tasting unfamiliar on his tongue, a hollow, dry sound. He was everywhere. His influence stretched across the city's commerce, its hidden banking channels, and its forgotten alleyways. His presence was the foundation of this very operation. His power was the air the staff breathed, whether they knew it or not. "Yeah," Rosalind said, leaning slightly on the counter as she organized a stack of bills. Her movement was graceful, unhurried, and devoid of the mechanical efficiency Archer often enforced in his other ventures. Her voice was low and smooth, not challenging, just stating a fact. "You've got that look. Too quiet, too observant for a regular shopper. You're scanning the room like you own it, but you don't look like you belong here either. You look like a tourist in a place you've only read about." Her assessment was chillingly accurate. He was scanning the room like he owned it because he did. Every square meter of laminate flooring, every poorly stocked shelf, every nervous staff member belonged to the empire he controlled. He realized that the simple act of observing the subtle shift of his weight, the steady sweep of his dark-lensed eyes, the way he held his posture was a habit ingrained so deeply it defied his cheap disguise. He was Archer Blythe, a man who saw threats and weaknesses before they manifested, and that primal vigilance was not easily shed. Archer managed a small, forced smile, a grimace that felt alien on his lips. The store, part of his sweeping criminal empire, was bustling with activity, a perfect front. It was meant to run like clockwork, generating clean revenue while masking the deeper, far more complex transactions that happened after closing. It was a well-oiled machine meant to look like harmless retail. However, for weeks, the reports had been vague and the profits low, the numbers failing to reconcile with the established rhythm of the business. Rumors of mismanagement and internal corruption had reached his ears, whispers of unaccounted inventory and unauthorized dealings, compelling him to come in person. He was here to see what was happening behind the scenes, to find the rot at the core of his operation before it spread. He glanced around the wide open sales floor. The shelves were stocked, the aisles busy, but the energy was all wrong. The underlying current was palpable: stress. The staff moved with a timid, hurried caution, avoiding eye contact, like people waiting for a silent explosion. He noticed a stock associate nervously rearranging an already neat display of small appliances, her hands trembling slightly. Another cashier was speaking in a clipped, nearly inaudible tone to a customer, desperate not to draw attention to herself. The lighting seemed too harsh, the music too quiet, lending the space a feeling of continuous strain. This was not the environment of a successful, thriving business. It was the atmosphere of a holding cell. Only Rosalind Glenn moved with a flicker of independence, a quiet rebellion in her posture that he found both alarming and utterly compelling. She was the one vibrant brushstroke in a muted, fearful portrait. She possessed a dignity that none of the other employees seemed to dare display. A middle-aged man, the acting supervisor, hovered near the back office, his tie slightly askew, his face a mask of strained alertness. He was a thick-set man with receding hair and a pale complexion, sweating slightly despite the ambient temperature. He darted quick, nervous glances around the room, clearly trying to project control while radiating intense anxiety. Archer watched as a younger staff member fumbled a display of small items near the front, causing a muted clatter. The supervisor's expression immediately hardened into a glare that promised retribution, a subtle shake of his head that carried the weight of a severe threat. The dynamic was not one of leadership, but of silent, oppressive command, fear used as the primary tool of motivation. This was precisely the mismanagement he'd heard about, but seeing the fear on his employees' faces was a new, cold kind of disappointment. It was inefficient, sloppy, and reflected poorly on his organization. Rosalind, oblivious to the drama at the back, counted his change precisely before pushing it across the counter. Her movements were economic, practiced, yet graceful. "Careful out there," she said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing his attention back to her. "Sometimes the biggest problems are the ones you can't see." He studied her face. Her brown eyes were serious, perhaps even burdened, but devoid of the sycophantic deference he was used to receiving from virtually everyone he encountered. There was a quiet strength in her chin, a subtle tightness around her mouth that suggested she was used to carrying weight far heavier than the day's cash transactions. He felt an intense, unexpected urge to ask her what she meant, to probe the depth of her observation, to peel back the layer of professional detachment she wore. He realized she wasn't just talking about the dangers of the street. She was speaking of the problems within the walls of the store. Archer took the change, his fingers brushing hers. The brief contact sent a wholly unwarranted shock through him, a minor electrical surge that momentarily shattered the cold shell of his composure. "I hope I see them soon," he replied, his voice a low rumble. He needed to find the source of the rot quickly. He had not built this empire to have it undermined by terrified employees and greedy underlings. He needed to understand the scope of the problem before his rivals, or worse, the authorities, caught wind of the internal chaos. His visit, meant to be clinical and detached, was already becoming personal. As she turned to the next customer, greeting them with that same warm yet professional smile, Archer took his bag and moved slowly toward the exit. He felt exposed, stripped bare by the perceptive gaze of a woman who was supposed to be nothing more than a nameless cog in his machine. He had expected to see theft, laziness, or procedural failures. He had not expected a challenge to his presence or a flicker of unexpected connection that resonated deeper than any financial statement. He paused near a display of brightly colored toys, watching the reflected light bounce off the plastic, his reflection hidden behind the dark glass of his sunglasses. He took a deep breath, the air in the store feeling stale and thick with unspoken fear. He needed to process what he'd learned. The fear among the staff pointed to more than just bad management. It pointed to an atmosphere of bullying and perhaps intimidation that went against the efficient, silent way his best operations ran. And Rosalind Glenn was the obvious counterpoint to this fear. She possessed a resilience that suggested a past and possibly a future that transcended her current role. He finally stepped outside, the cool, late afternoon air hitting his face. He walked deliberately to his waiting sedan, a nondescript dark sedan parked half a block away. Before opening the door, he glanced once more at the store sign. Inside, Rosalind was interacting with a customer, her expression fixed, her exhaustion visible only in the faint shadows beneath her eyes. The supervisor still lurked in the periphery, a constant, unpleasant presence. Archer took a final resolving breath. He had come here to assess the operation and fix the problem. After just a few minutes, he knew he couldn't do that by merely watching from the outside. The simple truth she had uttered, "You're not from here," was an invitation, a challenge, and a dismissal, all rolled into one. It told him he needed to go deeper. He had to understand the core of the problem, and that meant seeing his empire through her eyes. Archer Blythe had to see what Rosalind Glenn saw. He would have to stay much longer, truly blend in, live what his employees lived, to uncover the secrets hidden beneath the surface of his own store, and perhaps the secrets hidden beneath her own composed facade. His decision was made. The disguise would remain, and the observation would become immersion. Archer Blythe walked away from the entrance of his own store, the synthetic fabric of the cheap hoodie feeling suddenly stifling. He had intended this visit to be a detached clinical assessment, a quick surgical procedure to excise the rot of mismanagement. Instead, he felt a sting of personal intrusion, delivered by the unassuming cashier. Rosalind Glenn's 4 words, "You're not from here," had acted like a tiny, perfectly aimed scalpel, cutting through the layers of his carefully constructed disguise. He had spent his life cultivating an impenetrable aura, and yet this woman, who earned her wage-sorting change, had seen right through the superficial layer of fabric and shadow. He settled into the driver's seat of his dark sedan, not starting the engine immediately. He needed a moment to recalibrate his approach. Archer was used to people seeing him as a force, a symbol of power, or simply not seeing him at all, viewing him as background noise when he chose. He was stunned by Rosalind's casual perceptiveness. She wasn't just observing his clothes, she was observing his posture, his intent, and the way he held his gaze. She had accurately read the tension beneath his surface, the silent calculation of a man assessing a threat, not merely choosing a product. She is perceptive, yes, but what else, he thought, running a hand over the rough stubble he had intentionally grown for this role. Was she an isolated anomaly of sharp intellect, or was she a sign of a larger systemic problem where his employees were too smart, too observant, and therefore too dangerous? His empire relied on unquestioning compliance and a general fear that dulled the senses. Rosalind Glenn felt like an exception, and exceptions in his world always became liabilities. He decided to return. Not today, but tomorrow. He needed to be more than a one-time customer. He needed to blend in with the routine, become part of the store's landscape, an unremarkable face that offered no threat. The next day, Archer returned. He arrived 30 minutes after the store opened, carrying a tattered paperback novel and adopting a slumped, distracted posture. He bought a single item, a common, low-value consumable from a different cashier, then retreated to a small, seldom-used seating area near the front, positioning himself to observe the flow of traffic and, more importantly, Rosalind. She was there, operating her register with the same quiet efficiency. He noticed the contrast between her energy and that of her colleagues immediately. The other employees moved with a forced speed, their expressions tight with worry. They often glanced toward the back office entrance, anticipating the emergence of the supervisor, the man Archer had observed the previous day. This manager was a thick-set man named Wallace. Archer knew now, and he moved with a sort of aggressive slowness, his presence heavy and suffocating. Wallace was the obvious source of the tension. Archer watched him repeatedly interrupt a young stock clerk, not to correct a genuine error, but simply to assert dominance. The young man, trembling slightly, murmured apologies while Wallace spoke in low, cutting tones that carried just enough menace to silence anyone nearby. But Rosalind was different. When Wallace approached her station, Rosalind met his gaze directly. He said something sharp. Archer was too far to hear the exact words, but the manager's expression was clearly one of petty, habitual criticism. Rosalind nodded once, a quick, dismissive gesture, and immediately returned her attention to her customer, allowing the line to move forward without offering the groveling apology Wallace clearly craved. Wallace lingered for a moment, clearly frustrated by her lack of visible fear, before storming back toward the office. Rosalind's composure did not waver. She possessed a remarkable ability to remain professionally detached while radiating an aura that said, "I am doing my job, and your attempts to break me are irrelevant." Archer understood dominance and control better than anyone. Wallace was a weak, insecure man attempting to shore up his failing authority through intimidation, a cheap and ultimately ineffective strategy. What truly fascinated Archer, however, was Rosalind's immunity to it. Over the course of the long, slow afternoon, Archer continued his observation. He made small, incremental purchases, a cheap bottle of water, a stick of gum each time, ensuring the interaction was brief and transactional. He wanted to blend further into the background, becoming just another forgettable face. During a lull in the customer traffic, he overheard a fragment of conversation between Rosalind and a colleague, a middle-aged woman named Brenda, who was stacking merchandise nearby. Brenda was complaining quietly about the long hours and the insufficient pay. "I don't know how you do it, Rosie," Brenda whispered, leaning on a trolley. "You always look like you have somewhere better to be." Rosalind sighed, a sound of deep, buried weariness. "I do have somewhere better to be, Brenda Pill. I have to be there." She tapped her temple lightly. "I need the money for my mother's care, and I need the hours. I won't lose this job over that fat slug Wallace." Brenda shook her head sadly. "It's not fair, girl. You should be in college or doing something with those brains, not wasting away here." "I'm not wasting away," Rosalind replied, a sudden flash of steel in her eyes. "I'm buying time. This job is a placeholder. I am getting what I need from it, and when the time is right, I'll be gone. I have plans, Brenda, plans for something much bigger than standing behind this register." The conversation ended quickly as Wallace emerged again, scanning the floor, his presence immediately killing the casual atmosphere. Archer, sitting still and silent, absorbed every word. Rosalind was not just a perceptive cashier. She was a woman driven by severe, tangible necessity, her mother's illness, and propelled by secret ambitions. She didn't view this store as a career or even a long-term job. It was a resource to be exploited until she could leap to something greater. She was calculating, practical, and highly motivated. Archer recognized those traits. They were the foundations of his own success. The discovery deepened his internal conflict. He had come here to assess the operation and potentially dismiss employees responsible for the failing profits. Rosalind, by her own admission, was only there for the money. Yet she was the most competent person he had seen. More critically, she represented an unconscious challenge to his world. Her determination to rise above her circumstances, fueled by a genuine need, was a stark mirror to the ruthlessness with which Archer had built his empire fueled only by the need for absolute control. Archer watched as Rosalind finished serving a customer, her face briefly relaxing into a genuine expression of exhaustion before snapping back into its mask of professional composure. He felt a sudden, unexpected shift in his objective. It was no longer just about fixing the store's financial leakage. It was about understanding Rosalind Glenn. She wasn't just a cog. She was the key to understanding the deeper rot, the soul of the business that Wallace was actively extinguishing. He needed to know what her plans were. He needed to know what bigger meant to her. He needed to know if her desperate ambition could be a threat, or if it could somehow miraculously become an asset. As the day neared closing time, Rosalind began tidying her station with methodical precision. Archer knew he could not simply walk up and speak to her again. That would violate the invisibility he was struggling to maintain. He had to find a different angle, a way to observe her life outside of the store's walls. He decided that the next stage of his assessment required more than mere observation from a chair. It required immersion and investigation. He stood, stretching slowly to maintain the persona of a bored, waiting customer. As he walked toward the exit, he saw Rosalind glance his way. Her lips curved into the slightest of fleeting half-smiles, not of recognition, but perhaps of amusement. It was the smile of someone who recognizes a fellow observer, a kindred spirit of watchfulness. "I am not from here," she had said. Archer had to admit, standing in his own criminal front, disguised and overlooked, that he felt less and less from the world he had created every time he looked at Rosalind Glenn. He walked out, the fading light of the afternoon feeling less oppressive than the manufactured fear inside. He walked to the sedan and retrieved a small, highly advanced tracking and listening device from a hidden compartment. He would use his resources, his reach, to quietly learn everything about Rosalind Glenn. Her problems, her mother's illness, her ambition, they were all threads he could pull. He had come seeking financial facts. He was leaving hunting a complex human truth. This small cashier was unknowingly challenging the entire foundation of his empire simply by being herself. Archer knew with terrifying certainty that his life was about to become significantly more complicated, a realization that surprisingly did not bring fear, but a flicker of grim excitement. The hunt had begun. Archer's decision to transition from mere observation to active investigation was swift, cold, and utterly characteristic of the man he truly was. The minute details of Rosalind Glenn's life, previously irrelevant data points, were now crucial intelligence. He deployed resources not the heavy-handed intimidation tactics of his lieutenants, but the quiet digital infiltration units he kept for sensitive corporate espionage. He needed her secrets, not her fear. His initial inquiry confirmed the basic facts he'd overheard. Rosalind was driven by the necessity of her mother's severe illness, a condition requiring expensive, ongoing care that devoured her meager cashier's salary. This was her tangible anchor to the job, the reason she endured Wallace's tyranny and the long, exhausting hours. Archer found himself strangely relieved by this knowledge. It was a clear, logical motivation, something he could quantify. The digital footprints he uncovered, however, told a more complex story. Rosalind was not merely saving money. She was spending her nights immersed in old public records, cross-referencing financial databases, and following decade-old trails of anonymous news articles. Her search queries were specific, focusing on failed real estate ventures, shell corporations that dissolved without a trace, and most crucially, the unsolved disappearance of her father, Arthur Glenn, nearly 7 years prior. Arthur Glenn, a small business owner who vanished without a trace, was officially recorded as a missing person. Unofficially, everyone knew he had encountered the wrong kind of people in a bad deal. Archer's analysts quickly connected Glenn to a minor construction procurement scheme that had been quietly absorbed and then dissolved by one of Archer's own subsidiary companies years ago, a standard piece of territorial consolidation he had signed off on without a thought. The disappearance had been handled swiftly and cleanly by a now-retired associate. The connection was undeniable, though minuscule in the grand scheme of Archer's empire. This realization struck Archer with a cold, unsettling finality. Rosalind wasn't just working a low-wage job. She was a daughter on a long, quiet hunt, and her current employment was not just necessity, but possibly proximity. She was unknowingly standing directly in the shadow of the man she sought to expose. Archer found himself increasingly disturbed by the moral implications of this discovery. He was a mafia boss, hardened to the violence and the necessary ruthlessness of his life. But this felt different. Rosalind was not a rival or a threat to his business model. She was a casualty of a bureaucratic decision made years ago, a victim who had dedicated her life to pursuing a ghost he had created. His empire was a mechanism designed to generate wealth and control. It was not supposed to produce such poignant, determined suffering. He decided to continue his immersion in the store, using the disguise to observe Rosalind's behavior now that he knew her true motivation. He maintained his cover as the quiet, bookish customer in the faded jeans and dark hoodie. The atmosphere in the store was deteriorating under Wallace's increasingly erratic management. The turnover rate seemed to accelerate daily, and the tension was so thick it was almost audible. Rosalind remained the solitary anchor of competence. One afternoon, Archer watched Rosalind during her scheduled break. Sitting in the poorly lit, cramped break room, he could observe via a small, strategically placed surveillance feed his team had installed. Rosalind was not reading a book or resting. She was hunched over a worn notebook filled with looping, focused handwriting. Next to the notebook lay a cheap, well-used smartphone. She was cross-referencing data points, her brow furrowed in concentration. She highlighted names and dates that Archer recognized, former associates, legal filings, and property deeds that were all peripheral tentacles of his own organization. She was not just grieving, she was building a case. Her actions were quiet, meticulous, and fueled by a burning, focused hatred for the entity that had taken her father. Archer felt the familiar coldness of professional alarm begin to mingle with a strange, protective warmth. Rosalind was walking a razor's edge. If his associates realized she was investigating the disappearance, she would be dealt with swiftly, decisively, and brutally. The thought of his own people silencing her brought a wave of visceral rage he hadn't experienced in years. It was a possessive fury, a sudden, powerful realization that she was his problem, and nobody else was permitted to touch her. Days turned into a grueling week. Archer found himself losing sleep, not over his empire's finances, but over Rosalind's relentless, lonely investigation. He began leaving subtle, non-traceable digital trails, small anomalies in the public records, slight misdirections to guide her away from the most dangerous connections, primarily the names of his currently active and most ruthless enforcers. He was actively interfering with his own organization to protect a cashier he barely knew, a fact that would have earned him a quick bullet from any of his peers. This internal conflict was grinding him down. He was the architect of his world, a man who never questioned the necessity of his actions. Now, sitting disguised in a corner of his own establishment, watching the innocent, determined daughter of one of his peripheral victims, he was questioning everything. Then came the plot twist, delivered with Rosalind's characteristic subtlety. Archer was forced to approach the counter to buy a necessity, a specific type of battery he didn't actually need. Rosalind was the only cashier available. As she rang up the small purchase, she looked up, past the dark frames of his sunglasses, and held his gaze. "You're back again," she noted, her voice neutral. "I figured you might be. You seem to have a lot of free time to spend watching people shop." Archer responded with the curt neutrality of his assumed character. "The air is better in here than out." Rosalind gave a small, cryptic smile, one that didn't reach her tired eyes. She handed him the small receipt, their fingers briefly touching again. This time, however, she held the contact for a fraction of a second longer, and her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, too low for any nearby camera or ear to pick up. "You're investigating the store's problems, aren't you? Not just the employees," she clarified, her eyes flicking pointedly toward the back office where Wallace was currently berating a delivery driver. "But the deeper problems, the missing money, the unaccounted-for inventory, the things that go bump in the night when the doors are locked." Archer's blood ran cold. He had been conducting an investigation under the nose of his own staff for weeks, but Rosalind had conducted an investigation into him. He stayed silent, forcing his expression to remain blank, the ultimate neutral mask. Rosalind sighed quietly. "I know this place is just a front. It's a badly run front, too. But the rot here isn't just about Wallace's temper. It's about who he reports to and who they report to." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "My father, Arthur Glenn, was a fool who got involved with bad people years ago. People who ran their operations out of small, seemingly legitimate fronts. People who didn't tolerate questions." She was laying it out. She was telling him, a complete stranger she only knew as the too observant customer, that she was aware of the criminal framework. Rosaline continued, her voice gaining a quiet power that belied her petite frame. "I know this city's organizations. They are like snakes, shedding their skin every few years, changing the name on the door, but the venom stays the same." She tapped the receipt. "I'm not afraid of the local bullies. I'm interested in the top of the food chain, the ones who think they're untouchable because they hide behind lawyers and balance sheets." The chilling part was not that she knew the store was a front. The chilling part was the direct challenge. She was stating her intention to hunt the very organization Archer Blythe commanded, and she was saying it to him. Archer realized he was at a crossroads far sooner than anticipated. This was no longer a game of subtle observation. She wasn't just investigating. She was baiting the system, drawing attention to herself. He could either let her continue, knowing his associates would eventually find and eliminate her, or he could drop the charade and assert his authority. He settled on a calculated risk, a verbal nudge in the right direction, a final test of her mettle. "Sounds like a dangerous hobby," Archer said, his voice husky and low. "Some questions are better left unasked. Some truths cost more than you can afford." Rosalind did not flinch. Instead, a genuine, hard look of determination crossed her face, burning away the fatigue. "I've already paid the price for those truths. They took my father. I have nothing left to lose that matters more than finding the answers." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes glittering with purpose. "I'm not afraid of the snake, mister. I'm determined to cut off its head, no matter what it costs." She was not just determined. She was resolute. She wasn't looking for money or revenge. She was looking for justice, defined by her father's memory. Archer, the untouchable mafia boss, felt a profound, unexpected surge of emotion. It wasn't the thrill of the chase, nor the cold calculation of eliminating a threat. It was an overwhelming respect mixed with a fierce, protective instinct. He saw his own ambition reflected in her, stripped of all the cynicism and violence. Rosalind was a mirror showing him what strength looked like when it was pure, untainted by greed. He knew then that she was not a problem to be solved or a liability to be neutralized. She was a force that he, Archer Blythe, was determined to protect, even if it meant betraying the empire he had spent a lifetime building. Her quiet words were a direct threat to his entire operation, but they sounded more like a call to arms than an accusation. He took the small bag containing the batteries he didn't need and met her gaze one last time, a silent promise passing between them. He would no longer guide her away from the truth. He would guide her to it. And he would ensure she was safe when she got there. The facade of the quiet customer was cracking. It was time for Archer Blythe to decide what kind of man he truly was. Rosalind Glenn's deliberate confrontation, a verbal gauntlet thrown at a stranger, had shattered Archer's meticulous plans for subtle investigation. Her words, delivered with chilling calm, confirmed that she was not merely a threat. She was a focused, ethical force operating on principles Archer had long since discarded. He couldn't risk her talking to anyone else, nor could he allow his system to crush her. The window for stealth was closed. It was time for a controlled exposure. Archer needed to get her out of the store, away from Wallace's oppressive scrutiny and the distant, ever-watchful eyes of his organization's security protocols. He returned the following evening, shortly after the store closed, timing his arrival to intersect with her walk home. He waited, not in the sedan, but in the deep shadows of an abandoned entryway across the street, his unassuming hoodie and faded jeans finally serving their intended purpose. Rosaline emerged alone, carrying a worn backpack and looking utterly exhausted, the mask of professional detachment having finally slipped away. The faint lamplight revealed the heavy toll of her double life, long hours working, longer hours investigating, and the perpetual strain of caring for her mother. As she passed his hiding spot, Archer stepped out, blocking her path just enough to stop her without causing panic. "The mysterious man with the batteries," Rosalind said, her voice surprisingly steady, though she instinctively took a half-step back. She didn't scream or run. She merely adjusted her grip on her backpack strap and waited. "We need to talk," Archer said, keeping his voice low and firm. "About the snake in the head you're trying to cut off." Rosalind's brown eyes narrowed, losing their weariness and gaining a steely edge. "You want to discourage me? Or are you part of the problem?" "I am the owner of the problem," Archer stated plainly, deciding on immediate brutal honesty. He removed his sunglasses, letting her see his eyes clearly for the first time. His gaze, usually cold and imperious, was focused solely on her. "I own the store. I own the business that swallowed your father's last foolish venture. I am the man at the top." Rosaline did not gasp. She did not flee. She simply stared, her expression shifting through shock, then dawning comprehension, and finally settling on cold, hard certainty. This lack of visible fear, this complete refusal to crumble, unnerved Archer more than any gun pointed at his head ever could. He was accustomed to fear, to instant capitulation. Her stillness was revolutionary. "Archer Blythe," she stated, her voice barely a whisper, yet vibrating with controlled intensity. "I knew you were connected, but I didn't think you would be him, the name that shows up everywhere and nowhere." Her knowledge of his identity, his carefully protected private name, confirmed the depth of her investigation. She hadn't just followed local corruption, she had traced the corporate threads to the central weaver. "You're not surprised," Archer observed, tilting his head slightly. "Disappointed? Maybe," she corrected, a flicker of genuine sadness crossing her face. "But not surprised." The truly dangerous people always look the most unremarkable when you catch them outside their glass cages. I've been watching your organization for years. You're efficient, you're cold, but you leave tracks. Just not where anyone thinks to look. This was the confrontation he had been anticipating, yet it played out entirely differently. Rosaline didn't plead for money, nor did she threaten exposure. She did something far more potent. She challenged him on a moral level. "My father," Rosaline began, stepping closer, closing the distance Archer had hoped to keep. "He was greedy, yes, but he wasn't violent. Your organization took him and erased him because it was efficient. Tell me, Mr. Blythe, after all the wealth, all the control, does it actually feel like power, or is it just a perpetual state of defending the mountain of lies you built?" The question cut through Archer's formidable defenses like nothing had in decades. He had faced down armed men, government officials, and rival bosses, but no one had ever simply questioned the worth of his life's work. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of buried regret and sudden painful clarity. He was standing in his cheap disguise, listening to an exhausted cashier dissect his soul. "You think you know what I built," Archer countered, his voice rough. "I know what it costs," Rosalind shot back instantly. "It costs the freedom of every person who works in that store out of fear. It costs the memory of men like my father. And eventually, Mr. Blythe, it will cost you." "You look tired," she said, recycling her first observation, but now layered with profound meaning. "You look exhausted by the weight of your own choices." The raw truth of her statement hit him hard. He was tired. The constant vigilance, the necessary ruthlessness, the lack of any genuine human connection. It was a heavy burden, a life sentence of self-imposed isolation. He felt the vulnerability rising in him, a foreign and frightening sensation. He saw Rosaline not as a target, a casualty, or a witness, but as a person with an unwavering moral compass. He saw her courage, her devotion to her father, and the fierce independence that kept her standing tall despite the monumental obstacles she faced. He realized with dizzying certainty that he didn't want to lose this moment. He didn't want to silence her. He wanted to protect her. "I can give you answers about your father," Archer said, bypassing all usual protocol. This was the point of no return. "I can give you the details, the full truth. I can give you justice, Rosalind. But it won't be from the outside. It will be from the inside, by destroying what is mine." Rosalind's eyes widened slightly, the first true sign of shock he had elicited. "Destroying your empire? Why?" "Because you're right," he admitted. A quiet admission that felt like shedding armor that was too heavy to carry. "The cost is too high. I came here to find the rot, and I found it was systemic. I found it was me, and I found that you are the only thing worth saving in this mess." This was the emotional moment, raw and unplanned. His loyalty to the criminal empire, his pride, his years of self-justification, all of it was suddenly rendered insignificant by the simple, uncompromising presence of this woman. He was a man driven by power, but now he was driven by a powerful, unexpected surge of emotion for Rosalind. He didn't understand the feeling. It wasn't love, not yet, but a fierce, foundational protectiveness that superseded every law and rule he had ever established. "I need to know everything you have," Archer continued, taking one calculated step toward her. "The evidence, the names, the discrepancies you uncovered. We work together. We dismantle it, starting with Wallace and everything he represents. I will use my access to secure the proof. I will use my knowledge to point you toward the real damage. But if you do this, you become a target. You will be in more danger than you can possibly imagine. and you will have to trust me completely." Rosaline considered him, her gaze penetrating, searching for the lie, the trap, the angle. He offered none. He simply stood there, Archer Blythe, mafia boss, stripped of his context and offering up his entire treacherous life as sacrifice. "You're asking me to trust the man who ordered my father's erasure," she stated flatly. "I'm asking you to trust the man who has decided that your justice is worth more than his kingdom," Archer countered. "I can finish your hunt, Rosaline. No one else can." The silence hung between them, pregnant with the future. This was the decision point. Rosaline could walk away, expose him to the authorities or the press, and perhaps gain a measure of flawed public justice. Or she could align herself with the devil, gaining total, devastating truth, but risking everything. Finally, Rosaline gave a single, slow nod. "If I trust you, Mr. Blythe, I do so only because you look like a man who finally understands what it feels like to lose something irreplaceable, and you have the access I need. If you lie, if you betray me, I promise you the press and the police will be the least of your concerns." "Agreed," Archer said, feeling a sense of terrifying freedom. His decision was made. He would abandon the life he had known, the lies, the violence, the criminal empire, and protect Rosaline from the dangers that now surrounded her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small encrypted phone. "You need to dispose of the phone you're currently using. We communicate only through this, and tonight you tell me everything." He had come to save his assets. He was leaving, having pledged his loyalty to a fierce young woman who was determined to burn his assets to the ground. The ultimate choice had been made, and the dangerous game was now officially underway. The small encrypted phone was cold and solid in Rosaline's hand, a physical manifestation of the treacherous alliance she had just forged with the man responsible for her life's tragedy. Archer Blythe's confession, delivered under the weak glow of a street lamp, had been the discovery that collapsed her world, yet paradoxically validated her relentless search. She had spent years hunting a shadowy organization. Now she was partnering with its head. They moved quickly and silently into Archer's sedan. The interior was spacious, dark, and utterly removed from the noisy, fear-drenched reality of the store. It felt like an armored cocoon, a fitting place for a conspiracy. Rosaline immediately began to unload the totality of her investigation, speaking clearly and concisely, focusing only on the verifiable data. She detailed the unusual cash movements at the retail level, the unexplained inventory shrinkage, and the suspicious shell companies that funneled money away from the store's legitimate profits and into deep offshore accounts. She presented her evidence not with emotion, but with the cold, analytical rigor of a forensic accountant. Archer listened, his eyes rarely leaving her face, absorbing the details. Her diligence was stunning. She had, with rudimentary tools and sheer will, uncovered the exact mechanisms his lieutenants had used to skim millions from his peripheral operations. It was sloppy, arrogant theft, predicated on the belief that Archer Blythe never looked down. "Wallace reports to a man named Victor," Rosaline explained, tapping a note on her phone screen before handing it to Archer for destruction. "Victor manages the regional distribution chain. His signature is on several property transfers that use the same lawyers involved in my father's last failed deal. I think Victor is the key to the day-to-day corruption, the one who authorizes the intimidation in the stores." "Victor reports to Silas," Archer confirmed, his voice devoid of emotion. Silas was a high-ranking, highly trusted member of his inner circle, running the legal fronts and real estate. The realization that Silas was systematically betraying him brought a deep, silent fury that eclipsed his earlier moral conflict. "He has been a member of my organization for 20 years. This goes deeper than petty theft. The confrontation with the Mafia began before they had even fully formulated a plan. Archer, needing to clear the decks and confirm Rosalind's information, initiated several coded communications from the secure phone. One was a direct, unexpected order to freeze all accounts tied to Victor and Silas, citing unauthorized operational deviations. This move, sudden and total, was the equivalent of shouting in the silent criminal underworld. The response was instantaneous and violent. Archer's secure phone rang, displaying a restricted number. He answered it with a quiet formality that belied the danger. "Archer!" The voice on the other end, Silas's voice, was strained, filled with barely suppressed rage. "What is the meaning of this move on my accounts? You have just paralyzed half the regional logistics. This is a severe breach of protocol." "The protocol was breached when you and Victor decided my money was yours," Archer replied, his tone razor-sharp. "I've seen the numbers, Silas. The leakage is unacceptable, and the atmosphere in the retail operation is embarrassing. I'm conducting a deep review. You are suspended pending full audit." The line went silent for a dangerous moment. "You don't do this over the phone, Archer. Not after all these years. This is a personal visit. You meet with me, immediately, in the usual place." "No," Archer refused, the simple word a thunderclap. "I am handling this remotely, and the audit begins now. Do not interfere." He ended the call, his jaw set. Rosalind watched him, her eyes wide with the realization that she was sitting in the middle of a private, high-level coup. "That was him," she whispered. "The snake's head." "That was one of the major arteries," Archer corrected, looking at her with grim resolve. "They are on edge. They know someone is looking at the books. They assume it's a rival, or a government inquiry. They don't know it's me, not yet. But freezing the accounts is the same as declaring war." The sudden severity of the situation hardened Rosalind's resolve. "Good. If they're panicking, they'll make mistakes. What's the next move?" Archer admired her immediate jump from terror to strategy. He reached the decision he would use this immediate turmoil to his advantage, burning the system down from the inside before Silas and his allies could mobilize their full power. "They will meet. They will convene their inner group, believing they need to protect themselves from an external threat," Archer explained, his criminal mind now fully engaged in the fight. "I will preempt that meeting. But first, you need to go somewhere safe. You are officially off the grid. If they find you, they will use you to get to me." "I am not going to hide," Rosalind stated firmly, pushing away the terror that threatened to surface. "I spent 7 years searching for the truth. I am not leaving now. I am the one with the information on Wallace's network, on the retail-level discrepancies. You need me for the granular data, not just the names." Her refusal to retreat was the final confirmation Archer needed. His initial decision to protect her was now superseded by an understanding. She wasn't baggage. She was a partner, albeit an unwilling and dangerous one. "Fine," Archer conceded, a rare, reluctant admiration in his voice. "We won't hide. We will expose. But you must do exactly as I instruct when the time comes. This is a dangerous game, Rosalind. You asked me to trust you. Now you trust me." Archer drove them to a remote, heavily secured private residence he maintained solely for emergencies. It was stark, functional, and equipped with state-of-the-art communication tools. Over the next 6 hours, they worked in frantic, focused silence. Rosalind transferred all her data to his encrypted system. Archer, using his internal access, began pulling up the corresponding corporate records, security logs, and financial authorizations that proved Silas's betrayal, building an undeniable case of embezzlement and operational compromise. As dawn broke, Archer looked at Rosalind, who was meticulously annotating a spreadsheet detailing the transfer of funds through a bogus overseas entity. She had proven her value 1,000 times over. He knew the path ahead was clear. He would use his power to take down Silas and Victor, but he would not stop there. The entire empire, built on the efficient exploitation of people like Rosalind's father, was compromised, ethically and operationally. Archer made the final decision. He was going to dismantle the entire structure, not just the corrupt pieces. He was going to choose Rosalind and the potential of a life built on something real over the power and illusion of his criminal kingdom. This decision set the stage for the coming confrontation, a battle Archer knew he could not win without losing everything. His private residence, usually a sterile sanctuary of silence, hummed with a tension far more dangerous than any street violence. Archer Blythe, no longer in the anonymity of his hoodie and faded jeans, stood at a steel-backed communications console, wearing a dark, tailored shirt that subtly restored his aura of absolute command. Beside him, Rosalind Glenn was the picture of focused intensity, her exhaustion replaced by a burning, resolute energy. They had spent the night dissecting the Empire's arteries, preparing the evidence that would simultaneously expose Silas's betrayal and justify Archer's subsequent actions. The Mafia standoff was imminent. Silas, cornered and desperate, had called an emergency meeting of the Inner Circle, disguising it as an operational review necessary to combat the external threat he assumed was seizing their accounts. Archer, using his knowledge of their old protocols, knew exactly where and when that meeting would take place. Silas has mobilized 5 men, Archer stated, reviewing the security feed of the meeting location, a hidden, windowless room beneath one of the city's oldest import businesses. Victor is already there. They believe they are discussing a counterstrike against a rival. They are not expecting me. And they are certainly not expecting me, Rosalind murmured, tapping the tablet in her hands. She had organized the data into a series of clear, digestible graphics showing the exact points of financial leakage and the paper trail leading directly back to Silas. This evidence is irrefutable, Archer. Even if they wanted to defend him, they can't defend this level of theft and operational compromise. It doesn't matter, Archer said, turning to face her. His expression was grim, devoid of the complex vulnerability he had shown in the street. This was the calculating, ruthless boss returning, but this time he was fighting for a different purpose. They value loyalty over integrity, Rosalind. They will see his betrayal as a crime, yes, but my action as a far greater one. I froze the accounts. I challenged the structure. And now I'm bringing the hammer down based on the word of an outsider you. Rosalind met his gaze, showing no sign of intimidation. Then we make it clear that the outsider is an expert. You expose the financial ruin, and I will be ready to explain the chain of corruption, starting with Wallace and the store. Silas damaged the empire from the bottom up through fear and bad management. They hate inefficiency more than anything. Archer admired her bravery. She was fully aware of the danger, yet her focus remained purely on strategy and data integrity. I need you to remain here, Archer insisted, stepping closer, his voice low and final. This meeting will devolve quickly. It will be violent. I will use the internal codes to transmit the full file to you once the confrontation begins. If I don't check in within 1 hour of the meeting starting, you take that file and you transmit it to every regulatory agency, every internal ombudsman, and every public investigative outlet we can legally reach. Burn the whole system down. Protect yourself. "I told you, I won't hide," Rosalind repeated, her voice rising slightly. "My evidence is focused on the retail fronts, the legitimate shell. Your evidence is the top-tier money laundering. We dismantle this together, or we don't do it at all. The moment you enter that room, Archer, you cease to be a boss confronting a traitor. You become a target, and if you fall, the only thing that saves me is the release of this data, which requires both of us." Archer knew she was right. He couldn't risk leaving the ultimate kill switch entirely in the hands of his enemies, or trusting an outside force to act quickly enough. But he could not, would not, allow her to step into the physical danger. The compromise was difficult, achieved through a tense, low-voiced argument. Rosalind would stay secured in the residence, ready to transmit the devastating financial files. But she had another plan, a strategic move based on the social and logistical weaknesses she had uncovered. "When you confront Silas, you need to expose his incompetence, not just his greed," Rosalind urged. "You need to show them how bad the store environment is, how much fear Wallace generates. That kind of chaos breeds external scrutiny. It's a failure of control. They will turn on him faster if they see him as a liability to the whole organization's necessary veneer of legitimacy." Archer nodded, his plan coalescing. He would use the financial evidence to create chaos, and Rosalind's testimony about the store's breakdown to justify the necessity of the purge. He looked at Rosalind, knowing this was the last quiet moment they might ever share. He reached out, his powerful hand briefly cupping her cheek. "I swore I wouldn't lose you," he said, the admission raw and vulnerable, "no matter the cost to me." "Then don't lose," she replied, her eyes holding his steady. "I need that justice, Archer. Finish this." Archer walked into the meeting room without preamble. The hidden room was thick with smoke and the stale smell of expensive alcohol. 6 of his most senior members were arrayed around a long, polished table. Silas sat at the head, attempting to project confidence, but his eyes were sharp with panic and accusation. Victor, the logistics manager, was visibly sweating. The silence that greeted Archer was heavy, hostile, and utterly devoid of the usual courtesy. He did not sit. He stood at the foot of the table, his presence instantly dominating the space. "The meeting is over," Archer announced, his voice carrying the cold authority of final judgment. Silas surged to his feet, slamming his fist on the table. "This is a farce, Archer. You cannot freeze operational funds without consultation. This empire is not run on your whims. We demand to know who you are fighting." "I'm fighting a cancer," Archer said, projecting a 3-dimensional graphic onto the wall behind him. It was a simplified, devastating snapshot of Silas's recent transactions. "And the tumor is you, Silas. You and Victor bled the retail operations, compromised the supply chain, and created an organizational chaos that drew unwanted attention." The inner circle immediately erupted. Accusations flew, but Silas quickly shifted the focus. He knew the embezzlement was indefensible, but Archer's actions were unprecedented. "This is not about the money, men," Silas shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at Archer. "He is destroying the structure, and he is compromised. We all know he's been spending weeks acting like a common spy in the store. And why? Because of a low-level cashier, a woman he has now removed from the system. He is acting on emotion, a weakness we agreed to never tolerate." Archer felt the heat of the betrayal, not just Silas's theft, but the depth of his surveillance. They had tracked his movements, aware of his growing connection to Rosalind. "She is not the cause of the problem. She is the evidence of it," Archer countered, pressing a key on his handheld device. The projected image changed, showing Rosalind's meticulously gathered data on the store's terrorized atmosphere. It included security footage of Wallace intimidating staff, evidence of illegal inventory handling, and the resulting staff turnover rate, which was crippling their revenue. "You allowed this," Archer hissed, directing the accusation at Silas. "You allowed incompetence to foster fear. Fear breeds carelessness, and carelessness draws attention. Rosalind Glenn found your tracks because your system was sloppy. You were greedy and you were weak. I will not have weakness in this organization." The argument raged. Silas's allies began to fracture. They might have forgiven greed, but they would not forgive operational weakness. They hated the external scrutiny the chaos invited. Silas, seeing his support crumble, played his final desperate card. "The cashier's father, Arthur Glenn, he's tied to our old construction debt. She's hunting for justice. He knows this, and he protects her. He is willing to sacrifice us all for one woman. He is compromised." Silas drew a weapon, a muted black pistol, leveling it directly at Archer's chest. "The bylaws state that a compromised leader must be removed." Archer stood firm. He had anticipated the violence. He had come armed, but he preferred to end this with clean power. He pressed a final button on his device. Simultaneously, a high-pitched alarm began wailing through the facility, a code known only to the highest level of Archer's security detail. The sound was instantly deafening. At the same moment, the room's lights short-circuited, plunging them into suffocating darkness, broken only by the emergency red glow of the alarm system. Rosalind's plan. Archer had tasked her with a tactical distraction. She knew the location of the alarm panel and the electrical system from the old blueprints he had shown her. In the ensuing chaos, two of Silas's men instinctively moved toward the exits, believing they were under external attack. Archer used the darkness and the noise, moving with lethal precision honed over years of command. He moved toward the table, kicking the legs out from under the heavy piece of furniture, sending it crashing into Silas and Victor. The violence that ensued was brutal, fast, and driven by desperation. Silas fired blindly, the bullet tearing harmlessly into the thick, reinforced wall. Archer disarmed him, using the surprise and the weight of the overturned table against him. He fought with controlled fury, driven by the knowledge that Rosalind's safety depended on his total victory here. He disabled Silas and Victor swiftly, leaving them injured but alive, a necessity for the subsequent total purge of the system. The other Inner Circle members, stunned and disorganized, realized their situation. The boss was prepared, armed, and fighting with a terrifying new resolve. They knew they were on the wrong side of an irreversible organizational split. The fight ended not with more bloodshed, but with their silent capitulation. They watched, terrified, as Archer stood over Silas, confirming his complete, undeniable command. He secured the traitors and their allies, ensuring they were isolated and accounted for. He then activated the main communication screen. His final act of the confrontation was not a kill, but a confession and a promise. Archer faced the remaining members of his inner circle. "The Empire is compromised," he announced, his voice cold and final. "Not just by them, but by the corruption built into its foundation. As of tonight, the old structure is dead. We clean house. We dissolve every shell corporation tied to criminal enterprise. We liquidate the dirty assets. I have chosen a path of redemption and legitimate growth. Anyone who stands against this decision is a traitor to the new future and will face the same fate as Silas." He looked directly at the camera, knowing Rosalind was watching. He had fought not for power, but for the chance to prove to her that he was capable of change. He had won the battle, but the war for his soul and the future of his life with her was just beginning. The criminal world was crumbling, and Rosalind, the quiet cashier, had been the catalyst. The air in the hidden bunker was thick with the scent of ozone and spent aggression. The violence that ensued in the meeting room had ended quickly, not with an all-out bloodbath, but with the shock of total, unforeseen structural collapse. Archer Blythe had walked in to eliminate a threat. He had walked out having annihilated his entire life's work. Silas and Victor were secured in separate, soundproofed rooms, their immediate threat neutralized, their furious accusations muffled by the thick steel doors. The remaining Inner Circle members, their faces pale with shock and fear, were now arrayed not as allies, but as subdued, terrified subordinates awaiting judgment. Archer stood over them, his dark clothing bearing faint smears of blood that were not his own, his expression a cold mask of absolute resolve. He didn't need to issue threats. The sight of the chaos he had orchestrated, the sudden total severing of their financial lifelines, was enough. He spent the next hour issuing quiet, precise orders: liquidation of all high-risk assets, dissolution of key shell corporations, and the immediate, controlled release of financial documents to internal teams designated to cooperate with external regulatory inquiries. He was actively destroying his empire, transforming it from a criminal enterprise into a series of transparent, albeit messy, bankruptcies. The remaining men watched him, comprehension slowly replacing their terror. Archer was not merely punishing Silas, he was willingly accepting the consequences of his decision. He was giving up everything, the control, the prestige, the staggering wealth. He was choosing the wrecking ball over the throne. When the last command was issued, his voice was hoarse but steady. "You have a choice," Archer told the men, his eyes sweeping over their faces. "Cooperate with the dissolution, minimize the damage, and walk away with your freedom, or resist and face what Silas is facing." They chose cooperation, not out of loyalty, but out of a primal fear of the man who valued nothing above his new, ruthless sense of integrity. As the operation spun into controlled chaos, Archer finally returned to the secure residence where Rosalind waited. The heavy steel door hissed open, revealing her seated exactly where he had left her, surrounded by monitors displaying the final, devastating transfer of information. She had already activated her part of the plan, sending the granular data about the store's corruption and Wallace's network to multiple regulatory ombudsmen, burying the system in bureaucracy. She looked up, her expression tense, her eyes searching for injury. "Are you hurt?" Rosalind asked, her voice tight with concern, her focus entirely on his physical state. "No," Archer replied, wiping the smear of blood from his cuff. "The threat is contained. Silas and Victor are isolated. The Empire is being dismantled." Rosalind let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since he left. "You did it. You actually walked away." "I burned it down," Archer corrected, the exhaustion finally hitting him like a physical blow. He walked to the window, staring out at the rising sun, the stark, cold reality of his life losing everything settling over him. The feeling was twofold. There was the professional loss, the dismantling of decades of brutal, meticulous work, the eradication of his identity as the untouchable, powerful boss. He had been a king, and now he was a fugitive in his own city, systematically destroying the tools of his trade. He had sacrificed control, wealth, and security for an abstract sense of justice, and the strange, fierce protectiveness he felt for the woman standing behind him. But there was also a profound sense of liberation. The weight of the constant lie, the burden of absolute secrecy, was finally lifting. He felt lighter, cleaner, though still deeply scarred by the acts he had committed to build the very walls he was now tearing down. Rosalind walked up beside him, not touching him, but sharing the view of the clean, honest light. "My part is done," she said quietly. "Wallace and his local network are gone. The authorities will descend on the store by noon. They'll find the unaccounted inventory and the illegal transfers. My father's name may never be publicly cleared, but the system that took him is finished." "And what about you?" Archer asked, turning to her. "You are now officially linked to the man who is destroying his own criminal organization. You are the target of anyone who believed in Silas and the witness to my betrayal." Rosalind's stance remained firm. "I am a partner in its destruction. I didn't stay by your side because you were powerful, Archer. I stayed because you proved that you can change. You chose to protect an innocent life over your entire kingdom. That makes you the most dangerous kind of ally." This was the core of their bond, the true love, honesty, and redemption they shared. Rosalind didn't seek his past power. She trusted his capacity for sacrifice. Their love, nascent and fragile, was forged in the heat of this betrayal, built not on romantic fantasy, but on shared, dangerous reality. They were equally complicit in the Empire's downfall, and their fates were now inextricably linked. The subsequent weeks were a grueling blur of necessary actions. Archer, utilizing his remaining legitimate funds and contacts, arranged for the absolute safety and care of Rosalind's mother, moving her to an anonymous, high-quality long-term facility under a new identity. This was non-negotiable. He then worked relentlessly to clean his financial slate, directing his team to prioritize the payment of legitimate debts and the protection of innocent employees caught in the collapse. The aftermath was devastating, financially and socially. Archer's legitimate corporate holdings were seized, frozen, or liquidated to cover liabilities. His name became synonymous with scandal, a public dismantling that guaranteed he could never reclaim a life of power and influence. He was stripped bare, left with little more than a handful of liquid assets, the secure residence, and Rosalind. He was an exile, a ghost in the world he once ruled. Rosalind, too, struggled to adapt. She was no longer just the cashier with ambition. She was the woman who had brought down the organization that killed her father. She had sacrificed her anonymity and her simple dream of a quiet life to walk this dangerous path with Archer. They faced the daily challenge of navigating a world without the structure of fear and command. Archer found himself relearning basic human interactions. He had no staff to command, no bodyguards, no subservient subordinates. He had only Rosalind, who met his occasional involuntary command with an arched eyebrow and a steady counter-demand for transparency. He had to learn to ask, to share, to build consensus, a massive adjustment for a man who had built his life on silent obedience. "We need a name for what we do next," Rosalind said one evening, looking over the remaining cash flow projections, which were laughably small compared to his former empire's daily intake. "Survival," Archer stated simply. "No," she countered, pushing the paper toward him. "A purpose, a legitimate purpose. You were brilliant at logistics and structuring. I am good at finding the rot in the paperwork. We use those skills, but we use them to build, not to destroy." Archer looked at her, his heart heavy with the price they had paid. "I am damaged goods, Rosalind. No one touches me. My name is poison." "Then we work for ourselves," she insisted. "We start small. We become consultants who know how to find corruption because we know how corruption works. We offer security, not through violence, but through honesty and total transparency. We help people like my father, who get swallowed by the greedy shadows." This idea, born of Rosalind's pure ambition and Archer's dark knowledge, provided the first glimpse of a future free from the constant shadow of the criminal world. It was a long road, filled with new obstacles, but it was their road. The biggest price of change was the constant threat that lingered. Archer knew that Silas had powerful allies, men who were now implicated in the collapse, and who would inevitably seek retribution. They did not care about the money. They cared about the precedent Archer had set, the betrayal of the Brotherhood, the weakness shown for a woman. One evening, a low-level, non-traceable threat was intercepted through the secure network. A simple, chilling message. The game is not over. You can't cleanse the disease by cutting off one hand. Archer showed the message to Rosaline. "They are not going to let us walk away," he said, the old hardness returning to his voice. "Then we make sure the new life is too secure to touch," Rosaline responded, placing her hand over his. Her touch was a simple, non-commanding gesture, but it held the strength of a promise. The old Archer Blythe built walls of fear. The new Archer Blythe will build walls of legitimacy and truth. They can't attack what they can't understand. He realized then that his redemption wasn't a destination. It was a daily struggle, a partnership built on resilience and risk. He had lost the empire, the power, and the wealth. But in Rosalind Glenn, he had found something immeasurably more valuable, a mirror reflecting the man he could be, a woman who valued his potential more than his past. The struggle was brutal, but they faced it together, ready to build their new, honest foundation upon the wreckage of his former life. The dismantling of Archer Blythe's empire was complete, leaving behind a vast legal and financial wreckage. The process was painful, meticulous, and public, a deliberate exposure that ensured no one could ever credibly accuse him of merely shifting assets. He had lost everything material, but in the aftermath, he was the master of a small, fortified bunker and a singular, determined alliance. The secure residence, stripped of all unnecessary luxuries, became the headquarters for their new venture. They called it the Ghost of Justice. The name was Rosalind's idea, reflecting their goal, to operate invisibly, cleaning up the shadowy messes left by powerful, unseen corruption. Their services were not advertised. They relied on Archer's deep, if now hostile, knowledge of the financial underworld and Rosalind's brilliant capacity for forensic investigation. Their first few months were spent in utter isolation, refining their methods. Rosalind taught Archer to embrace transparency in their new dealings, forcing him to document every expense, every contact, and every piece of information they acquired. It was a rigorous, challenging re-education for a man accustomed to operating in the ultimate opaque environment. Archer, in turn, taught Rosalind the lethal logic of the criminal mind, how to identify pressure points, anticipate retaliation, and understand the coded language of power. Their work was a delicate dance between Archer's pragmatic ruthlessness and Rosalind's moral clarity. They took on cases that spoke to Rosalind's initial motivation: small businesses swindled by corporate predators, families ruined by financial manipulation, and victims trapped in bureaucratic corruption. They didn't seek public glory or large settlements. They sought the quiet, total restitution of truth and assets. One evening, 4 months after the collapse, Rosalind was tracking the movement of a large asset fraudulently seized from a family farm cooperative. She leaned back, rubbing her tired eyes, the green glow of the monitors illuminating the deep exhaustion that still haunted her. "They're not even clever anymore," Rosalind muttered, pointing to a series of offshore transfers. "They rely entirely on the victim giving up. They assume no one will trace the money through 3 shell companies and 2 different jurisdictions." Archer, across the room reviewing the complex legal statutes governing foreign holding companies, nodded. "That's the arrogance of power, Rosaline. They believe the system is too complicated and too expensive for the average person to fight. They believe they're invisible." "Not to us," she said, a hint of steel in her voice. "We know exactly where to look because we know the signature of an invisible man." Their professional success, however small in scale compared to Archer's former life, provided a necessary distraction from the ever-present danger they faced. They knew the peace wouldn't last, Silas was a patient, vengeful man, and his allies were ruthless. Archer had not only taken his power, but had publicly humiliated him, the one unforgivable sin in their world. The counterstrike came on a cold, rainy Tuesday, far from the polished mahogany tables of the old empire. Archer and Rosalind were working on a case involving a massive construction fraud scheme, a familiar territory for Archer's old organization. The fraud involved inflating costs on public infrastructure projects and routing the surplus into various shell companies. It was precisely the kind of operation Silas and Victor excelled at. Archer had arranged a secure, anonymous meeting with a former accountant of the implicated construction firm. The meeting was set for a neutral public location, a busy downtown park near a commuter railway line chosen specifically for its noise and constant traffic flow, making discreet surveillance almost impossible. Rosalind remained at the headquarters, monitoring the communication link and running real-time analysis of any anomalies in the area's digital chatter. Archer wore his disguise, the hoodie and faded jeans, but this time, beneath the unassuming layers, he was equipped with specialized communication devices and a concealed weapon. He was no longer a civilian. He was a ghost entering enemy territory. He arrived first, settling onto a wet iron bench near the fountain, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. He was looking for Silas's signature, the efficient, coordinated movement of experienced professional operators. He saw nothing. The park was filled with oblivious commuters, scattered tourists, and a few individuals seeking shelter from the drizzle. The calm was unnerving. The accountant arrived, a nervous, thin man carrying a worn briefcase. He quickly sat beside Archer, huddling against the cold. "I can't talk long," the accountant whispered, his eyes darting frantically. "They found out I was asking questions. They threatened my family. The fraud is massive. It goes all the way up to the city council, and it's all funneled through the North Star Development shell." Rosalind's voice crackled through Archer's earpiece, sharp and urgent. "Archer, abort. North Star is a dummy corporation Victor personally managed. They knew you'd look here. It's a trap." "Too late," Archer murmured, his gaze locking onto a slight, almost imperceptible movement. 3 men, dressed in unremarkable business casual, had emerged from the flow of commuters near the railway platform. They were closing the distance with practiced, silent coordination, forming a triangle that pinned Archer and the accountant against the fountain. The accountant noticed the movement, and his eyes widened in sheer terror. He bolted upright and ran, heading for the busy street, his briefcase clutched tight. Archer acted instantly, recognizing the immediate danger. He was the target. The accountant was merely bait. Archer didn't pursue the fleeing man. He moved toward the nearest threat, using the geometry of the park to his advantage, pulling his concealed weapon in one fluid motion. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Silas's men were professionals, but they were operating in a public space, limited by their need for discretion. Archer was fighting with a terrifying new clarity, fueled not by empire building, but by the necessity of survival and Rosalind's safety. He incapacitated 2 of the attackers quickly, their movements hampered by the slippery cobblestones and the fear of drawing too much attention. The 3rd man, more focused and clearly the leader, broke the standoff, drawing a large knife. He lunged, forcing Archer into close quarters. "Silas says hello, boss," the man spat, his eyes filled with feral hatred. "He says the new you is weak." Archer parried the knife strike, the cold steel scraping against his forearm, drawing blood. The pain was irrelevant. "Silas is wrong," Archer growled, delivering a disabling strike that sent the attacker staggering back into the fountain, the icy water momentarily stunning him. Archer didn't linger. He knew the fight had drawn attention. He activated a distress beacon on his device, a silent, encrypted signal that only Rosalind would understand, a code for immediate extraction needed. He disappeared into the railway station, melting into the tide of the evening rush. Back at the headquarters, Rosalind had gone from analytical calm to frantic, focused motion the moment she heard the disruption. When the distress beacon sounded, she acted instantly, initiating their pre-planned extraction protocol. She secured the headquarters, armed herself with a small handgun Archer had trained her to use, and took a separate, highly customized vehicle hidden several blocks away. She drove the route they had meticulously mapped for this exact scenario, a complex series of turns and back alleys designed to lose any pursuit. She found Archer 2 hours later, exactly where he had told her to wait. A darkened, abandoned warehouse near the port, his hoodie stained with rain and his own blood, leaning against a stack of crates. He was focused, alert, but clearly in pain. "They used Victor's operation as bait," Archer rasped, letting Rosalind examine the deep but non-life-threatening slice on his forearm. "They knew my weakness, my inability to let those who fight corruption fail. They knew where to strike," Rosalind agreed, applying a sterile dressing to the wound with clinical efficiency. "They hit the principle you just built, not the structure you destroyed." The revelation of their vulnerability was a painful shock. They had operated under the assumption that their location and communication were secure. The attack proved that Silas had resources that could still penetrate their shield. "The operation is compromised," Archer said, his voice flat with defeat. "Not the data, but the safe space. Silas has eyes we didn't account for. We have to move." They spent the remainder of the night packing only the essentials, the encrypted data servers, the communications equipment, and the necessary supplies. They left behind the security of the bunker, abandoning their last vestige of stability. The ghost of justice was now truly a ghost, forced to constantly move. Rosalind drove them north, towards a series of secure, pre-arranged safe houses that Archer had set up years ago as fail-safes against external threats. She drove with grim determination, the weight of their precarious new life settling heavily upon her. "They will keep coming," Rosalind stated, looking across at Archer, who was silent, staring out at the dark road. "This isn't just about revenge, is it? It's about precedent. You can't be allowed to succeed in leaving." "No," Archer confirmed, his gaze returning to her. "If I succeed, it proves that the Empire can be betrayed and survive. That shows weakness. I have to be silenced or killed to restore the order. This is a fight for the soul of the system." He reached out, his hand finding hers on the gear shift, a silent acknowledgement of their shared fate. "We are now truly alone, Rosalind. Every choice, every action will be a direct challenge to the authority I once held." Rosalind tightened her grip on the wheel and accelerated into the darkness. She knew the life of peace she had briefly glimpsed was gone. They were fugitives now, pursued by a vengeful empire they had personally gutted. But as she drove, she felt no fear, only a burning, focused resolve. She had found her justice, and now she would fight to protect the man who gave it to her, no matter the cost. Their new life was a constant battle, a relentless series of tactical choices and near escapes. They were not fighting for money or power, but for the right to exist outside the tyranny of the criminal world. The ghost of justice had become a rallying cry, a dangerous promise whispered in the shadows, and Rosalind and Archer were its weary, determined executioners. The ultimate confrontation was not over. It had merely entered its most brutal phase. The air in the service tunnel was cold, heavy with the smell of damp concrete and the metallic scent of fear. Archer held Liam close, his heart hammering against his ribs. a primal, overwhelming instinct overriding every learned behavior from his past life. He had spent 5 years building a wall of anonymity. Silas had destroyed it in minutes by striking at the only unprotected part of his existence, his son. Rosalind's voice, crackling over the satellite line, was the anchor in the storm. She was far from hysterical. The sheer terror of the situation had sharpened her focus into cold, hard steel. "I have the exit location confirmed," Rosalind reported, her voice low and steady. "The immediate area is saturated with high-frequency jamming, their attempt to silence you. I am coming in from the northeast quadrant, using the urban sewer lines as cover. We will meet at the old warehouse drop point in 40 minutes. "Understood," Archer confirmed, his gaze sweeping the tunnel for any signs of pursuit. Liam, quiet and trembling, was the single, non-negotiable priority. "The target is neutralized, but the threat vector is confirmed." "They knew the soccer field, Rosalind. They knew Liam's schedule. They have deep access." "We activate the complete burn protocol," Rosalind stated, her decision immediate and final. The burn protocol meant abandoning every piece of data, every clean identity, every financial trail they had established in the past 5 years. It meant starting over with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the knowledge in their heads. No more suburbs, no more consultants. We are activating the Vanya file now. We force him to surface. Archer felt the familiar coldness of the hunt return, a grim relief replacing the terror of the attack. The Vanya file. We don't touch her, but we make sure he thinks we have her. We retaliate with the one threat he understands. He ended the call, knowing the life they had carefully constructed was over. The gentle, redeemed existence was finished. Now began the war for their survival, a fight for the soul of the system. The next 48 hours were a blur of desperate, synchronized action. Rosalind executed the burn protocol with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that every financial tether, every alias, and every digital footprint leading back to Glenn and Associates evaporated into unrecoverable noise. Archer, meanwhile, focused solely on the counterstrike. They used a complex chain of encrypted, untraceable messages designed to look exactly like the work of a panicked, sophisticated kidnapper. The messages, originating from obscure Eastern European servers, were delivered to the trust fund lawyer, managing Natalia Vanya's endowment. The content was simple. Natalia Vanya is no longer safe. The protocol has been breached. Immediate. Emergency extraction is required to the designated rendezvous. Crucially, the messages did not threaten Natalia. They threatened her safety, implying that Archer had lost control and that she was now at risk from the chaos. This was the key psychological leverage. Silas knew that if anyone had the ability to penetrate the school's defenses, it was Archer. He wouldn't risk contacting the school directly, fearing exposure. He would go to the only person he believed could fix the problem, the trust fund lawyer, an old, reliable connection. Rosalind and Archer set the meeting location, a vast, abandoned shipping yard in their old city, an area defined by derelict steel and shadowed corners. It was a place only an old associate would know and trust as neutral ground. Rosalind and Liam were secured far away, in a remote, high-security hideout. Rosalind maintained contact, running real-time analysis of every surrounding digital signal. Archer arrived alone, armed, and wearing his tactical gear beneath his civilian clothes. He stood amidst the skeletal shadows of the giant cranes, the cold wind whipping the dust around his feet. He was the bait. Silas arrived, not with a kill squad, but alone. He walked out of the gloom, his face ravaged by 5 years of running and the fresh terror for his daughter. He looked older, smaller, his expensive clothing now rumpled and stained. "You're a monster, Archer," Silas hissed, stopping 20 feet away. He did not draw a weapon immediately, the fear for Natalia momentarily overriding his murderous intent. "After everything, you sink to kidnapping a child?" "I didn't touch her," Archer stated, his voice calm, betraying nothing. "But I made you believe I did, because you tried to kill my child." Silas flinched, the realization hitting him. Archer hadn't taken Natalia. He had exposed her and made her vulnerable, a cold, surgical strike of psychological warfare. The soccer field was a mistake, a message. You can't run a world on sentiment, Archer. "My world runs on one sentiment now. Protection," Archer countered, taking a slow step forward. "You forced the escalation. You attacked my son, the only thing I built that was clean. That is the one unforgivable sin. I am not going to live my life waiting for you to use her against me," Silas admitted, the raw truth finally stripping away his arrogance. He drew his pistol, the motion slow and deliberate. "We finish this here, Archer, one way or another." The gunfight that erupted was brief, brutal, and final. It was not a chaotic battle. It was a duel between two masters of a dying art. Silas, driven by pure, incandescent hatred, was predictable. Archer, fueled by the cold necessity of his family's safety, was precise. Archer did not aim to kill, only to disable. The shot was clean, impacting Silas's shoulder, sending the pistol clattering harmlessly against a steel beam. Silas collapsed with a ragged cry, immobilized. Archer walked toward him, not with triumph, but with cold, absolute finality. He stood over the defeated man. "Natalia Vanya will remain safe," Archer stated, pocketing his own weapon. "I will ensure the trust fund is secured by legitimate, non-criminal oversight. But you, Silas, are done. You attacked my family. You attacked the one truth I built." Archer did not call the police. That would expose himself and Rosalind to endless legal scrutiny and reveal their identities to the wider criminal world. He used his remaining, highly specialized contacts, legitimate operatives he had secretly built over the past 5 years, to ensure Silas was quietly removed, his existence erased from all public and criminal records. Silas disappeared into a deep, anonymous black site, where he would live out his remaining years in solitary, secure obscurity, forever cut off from the world he knew, and more importantly, from his daughter. He was neutralized completely, the ghost laid to rest. The threat was gone. The intense, suffocating danger that had defined their lives for 5 years evaporated. Rosalind confirmed the silence. No new protocols, no further attempts at penetration. The final reckoning had worked. The Vanya file was sealed and archived, its existence a quiet promise that the darkness of the past would not consume the light of the future. 6 months after the final confrontation, Archer and Rosalind moved into a new permanent home, a beautiful old stone house nestled in the high, quiet hills, far from the suburbs and the city's immediate reach. It was still secure, but the overwhelming burden of constant surveillance was lifted. Glenn and associates thrived. They became the quiet legends of corporate cleanup, known for their ability to find the truth where no one else dared to look. They were successful, clean, and fiercely ethical, a testament to the principles Rosalind had instilled. They were finally free to operate with a degree of openness, shielded by their impeccable reputation and the sheer improbability of anyone connecting them to the defunct criminal empire. Rosalind's mother, safe and well cared for, was brought to live with them, adding a quiet, loving presence to their home. Their true life, however, was within the walls of their house, centered around their son, William. One crisp autumn afternoon, Rosalind found Archer not at the console, but outside, kneeling in the grass. He was teaching Liam, now 5 years old and brimming with curious energy, how to properly secure a small wooden birdhouse they had built, anchoring it to the old oak tree with strong, careful knots. Liam looked up at his father, his eyes serious and intent, reflecting the light of the afternoon sun. "Daddy, why do we have to make the knot so tight? Will the bad guys shake the tree?" Archer looked at his son, then at Rosaline standing nearby. He smiled, a genuine, warm expression that had become common on his face. The hardness in his eyes was replaced by quiet reflection, but the vigilance remained. "We make the knot tight, Liam," Archer explained, his voice gentle and clear, "because we build things to last. We build things to be strong and honest so they can keep what's good safe." He was no longer Archer Blythe, the mafia boss. He was a father, a husband, and a builder of lasting, honest things. Rosalind joined them, kneeling to admire the small, secured birdhouse, a symbol of their hard-won stability. She reached for Archer's hand, their fingers intertwining. The life they had forged was hard-won, built on betrayal and sacrifice, but it was solid, honest, and anchored by the absolute certainty of their love and their shared commitment to justice. They had lost an empire, but they had gained everything that truly mattered: the freedom to live, the satisfaction of their work, and the overwhelming, quiet joy of watching their son grow up safe. The ghost of justice had found its permanent home, built on a foundation of truth, stronger than any fortress of fear. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.